bonjour, bonsoir, guten Morgen, guten Nachmittag, guten Abend, Laila Tov. Actually, you say that when you're leaving somebody in Hebrew, but all right. So the point of the matter is Saturday night, but this is technically still Thursday morning. Yes, I've managed to. I'm sorry, I'm thought of this 1980s Saturday Night Live skit where it's a parody of these Visa or some credit card company where there's the real commercials have a phone operator at all times, day and night, responding, and the real commercials had a flummoxed customer at an airplane or at a hotel, and they lost their card and they called a card hotline, and the real commercial shows the attentive and helpful card agent saying, yes, I'll get you a card immediately and everything like that. And in the parody in the Saturday Night Live, Roseanne Barr, whom you might know who Roseanne plays the card agent, only instead of being friendly and sweet, she's crusty and irritated. And at one point, Phil Hartman, may he rest in peace, plays the customer. He says, it's 3 a.m. and I've lost my card. Is there any way you could get my replacement card to me by the morning? And she says, look, buddy, if I had that kind of power over time and space, do you think I'd be sitting here at 3 a.m. listening to you? Anyway, so it's almost 11:30 on Saturday night, but it's actually really Thursday morning. So my purpose in the last segment of this lecture is, after having spent 2 minutes explaining this old Saturday Night Live joke, here I'll say another joke that my friend Brad Wilson at Princeton University just sent. Why should you never order, or you should never order flowers from a monastery? Remember, only you can prevent florist friars. There. With that in mind, let's talk about justice and the Republic. All right. So book one is over, and now it's book two. I love being a genius. So what I'm going to do in this discussion is to kind of walk you through very quickly through the ensuing couple of books of the Republic, up to the end of book 4, which contains the actual definition of justice, and the end of book 5, or close to the end, where the interesting things you have to do to bring the just city into being and what the just city looks like. And then talk about the rest of the Republic very quickly. But then I've added these to my notes, is a discussion of what exactly we have learned. What has the Republic taught us about justice? What does Socrates/Plato teach about justice? Better yet, this fifth part of the lecture, which will be part of part 4. I know it's 2 + 2 = 4, unless you're in the Ministry of Truth, in which in Orwell's 1984, in which 2 + 2 = 5. What have we learned? What Pavarotti thinks Plato and Socrates teach about justice, but the Republic. So in book 2, so technically Socrates thought he was off the hook for argument, even though he loves argument. But Glaucon and Adeimantus, Plato's real brothers, who I think represent the most philosophically inclined among these young men, step forward as the yellow crayons in the box. Actually, I'd never heard that expression before. At Converse in the 90s, 2 of our favorite students in the Department of History and Politics were the Poston Twins, who were identical twins, really identical. I've had several in my 40 years of college teaching. And one of them was fond of saying, I'm not the yellow crayon in the box. All right. Glaucon and Adeimantus are the yellow crayons in the box. And and how did they actually launch the rest of the dialogue? How so? In a way, they go back to the question, regardless of what justice is justice better than injustice? And remember, since Socrates is claiming to pursue knowledge, these kids, like you and I, grew up in a society where our opinion is that justice is better than injustice. And where'd you get the idea? Where did these guys get the idea that justice is better than injustice? Well, they got it from their parents and from their cities and their religious instructors. And and in particular, they've heard two opinions from their parents. That in this life, being just leads to the goods of this world. You might have heard it in a sort of an American or a modern version. Honesty is the best policy. If you do what's right, the good things will come to you. And then the second, of course, and this is remember you've encountered somebody moved by this opinion, is that the gods, or God, reward justice after life, after death and the afterlife. Whether that's resurrection in the Jewish and Christian traditions and Muslim traditions, or whether that's reincarnation in the 1,000 different incarnations of the soul journeys in the Bhagavad Gita, on its way to enlightenment and the release from the illusion of existence. Regardless, the idea is that let's just restrain ourselves to Western reflection. Although again, I don't think there's a fundamental difference in Eastern religion and traditions in this. Although there may be in Zen Buddhism something like a Socratic embrace of this argument, but that's for another class. So what's the problem? Well, of course, and there's this there's this interesting mythos, story tale, which launches the question, the Ring of Gyges. And by the way, when you hear what the Ring of Gyges is and how it comes to light, is it possible that Tolkien got part of the idea for the Lord of the Rings from this? Possibly. And possibly from the Nibelungenlied, from Wagner's 3,000-hour opera about the Twilight of the Gods, the ring cycle. Anyway, regardless of how Tolkien got the idea, you're going to about to learn the Ring of Gyges. Gyges was a shepherd who one day is doing this shepherding thing, and the pit opens up, and there's a corpse, and there's a ring, and he takes the ring and he puts it on, and soon he discovers that it renders him invisible to everyone around him. So what does he do? He makes hay while the sun shines, so to speak. He starts raping and looting and stealing, and then he kills everyone, and then becomes the tyrant of the city. And Glaucon pushes this and says, doesn't this prove that it's just an opinion that the good things of this world? In fact, if you're crafty, and just like Thrasymachus says, if you're unjust enough, meaning in his strange universe just, and if you can get away with it, then the evidence of this life suggests that the tyrant, and you're going to see the tyrant has a special role in the unfolding of the Republic, because the tyrant is the one, like Gyges, who does everything that you blame as injustice. And what Glaucon suggests is contrary, and like Thrasymachus says, contrary to our blaming of that person, our parents tell us this story, this fable, that Santa Claus is coming to. Oh, that's the second question, as you're going to see. That the good things come to those who are good in life, only to try to prevent you from doing wrong. I've asked many students at Congress College, for instance, Congress University, about the honor system. And this is a kind of a grim fact that this is, I think, a 10-year-old statistic or so. But at that point, and I'm sure it's gotten only worse, that 83% of graduating high school students from American high schools even believe that cheating is an ethical violation anymore. Which means, in some ways, like Thrasymachus, if you can do it, and like Gyges, if you can do it and get away with it, what's the problem? The second opinion, that the gods reward justice, and then Arimantos is the one who pushes this. He says, well, what if there aren't any gods? What if God or gods are just a figment of somebody's imagination, a campfire tales around the dark to make us think that the universe is not as bleak and empty as It really is. And by the way, this is exactly what Nietzsche had in mind when he said God is dead. He meant that Western humanity had grown to the point where we know that all those belief in gods, but not just God, but also belief in objective nature, is simply a childhood fantasy of the past. Okay, that's a pretty intense challenge to justice, because the tyrant, the conclusion of these is the person who has the greatest chance for happiness in this life is the tyrant, the most unjust man. So what the guys want, what you want, what everybody wants, is they want some proof, not based upon myths of the afterlife, not based upon some empirical claim that we often see to be falsified by experience. Yes, it's true that Saddam Hussein got hanged, but Stalin died of a stroke, and God knows the blood that he had on his hands, and it didn't seem to bother him. So on one level, the empirical objective purpose or defense of justice, and this is what it comes down to in Book 2, is to show that human happiness cannot be had without justice. Now, this question of whether you can be happy in this life without justice, you're going to see that in the Ethics, Aristotle comes back to this, and there might be an overlapping argument here. And it's something like this. Aristotle points out, people want all kinds of things in life. They want money, they want honor, they want tenure. Forget it. They want love, they want peace on earth, they want all kinds of things. But the one thing that people want for its own sake, in other words, people want money. Why do you want money? Why do you want love? Why do you want children? Well, that's a question. Why do you want all these things? Why do people want the things they want? Because they think it will make them happy. And therefore, it's difficult. You might find people who despair of life, but you don't find people who want to be unhappy. Nobody wants to be unhappy. Therefore, Aristotle, in a way, Plato, this is part of the ground of this argument, but certainly for Aristotle in the Ethics, the universal desire for happiness is a proof that human beings actually want to be happy, because you can't find a human being who wants to be unhappy. So on one level, if Plato can show, if Socrates can show that you cannot be happy in this life, and that the only person that has a chance of being happy in this life is the just person, and if you can show, as the Republic eventually does, that the tyrant, the most unjust person, is actually the unhappiest person, a miserable human being, just like a Voldemort from the Harry Potter series. So on one level, this is the way the Republic unfolds. Socrates is going to try to show you objectively, scientifically, like I can show you that sodium and chloride, when they mix, form salt, like a scientific process of the universe. So in other words, a scientific grasp of the human condition, that you can't have happiness without justice. Wouldn't that constitute an objective defense, an empirical, scientific defense of the goodness of justice and its preference? Now, in order to get to that, you'd have to know what happiness is, and you'd have to know what justice is, and the Republic comes to both of those. So they start this. So let me just say, I said this earlier in one of the other parts of this lecture, and it's worth repeating. I think the Republic is Plato's real defense of Socrates. In some ways, the defense that Socrates himself didn't make a very good trial or statement of in his own trial. Remember, the two crimes he was charged with was not believing in gods of Athens. He probably is guilty of that one. But he's pretty good. But Plato was pretty good at concealing Socrates. That we could talk more about that. But that he's corrupting the young. And what does corruption mean except teaching them the indifference, to be indifferent to justice versus injustice? In the Republic, he really is trying to get these young guys to be good people. He really is trying to provide a non-fabulous, non-mythical, non-faith-oriented embrace of the just life as a fact, as a provable fact. Now, he may be wrong, he may not succeed, but clearly he is not trying to corrupt these young men. So, how do they start the search for justice? They admit that one man is a small thing, and I think this is kind of a tongue-in-cheek launching of the dialogue, but then they admit that a city is much bigger than a single person, so let's create the just city. Let's create a city, make it perfectly just, take our justice identifying conceptual flashlight and look around and see if we can find what justice is. And so in books 2 and 3 they launch the city. And the city moves up from like a concern for material needs. It gets wealthy, and then people get greedy, and then you need laws, and then it turns out that you need soldiers, and you need different kinds of people, you need classes, and etc. So I won't go into too much on that, but on one level, what they're looking for in the just city is, and we'll come back to this, is the city that produces the common good, justice for all in the city, in which the rulers rule for the common good, and everybody gets what is owed to them in this city. It's the perfectly just city in that sense. Turns out this city has classes, and by the end of book 3, and you get to the beginning of book 4, it turns out that the classes in the city are built upon, by analogy, to the structure of the soul. Because in book 4, this is why book 4 is so central to the Republic, and is the soul emerges. Now, this is the Platonic idea of the soul. It's not the Christian or Jewish understanding or Muslims understanding of the soul. In some ways, there might be some kinship to the Hindu understanding of, especially the 3 castes in Hinduism, which sound very much like the 3 classes in the Republic. There have been claims both by Indian scholars and by Western scholars who got what from what. But at least what I want to say here is, what is the soul? Because lots of people believe in souls. Cephalus believes in souls. And most of us say the soul is that eternal part of us that's connected temporarily with the body and life, the result of the gods, and that at death it separates, and then at death you carry into the afterlife all the deeds and good deeds you've done, and that there's weight and judgment, and you live forever. That's not the soul that emerges in book 4. The soul that emerges in book 4, how do you define it? I would say it's kind of a range of consciousness, a range of powers of the different functions of human consciousness, and which is the source of human action. The Greek word for soul is psyche. It's pronounced in English psyche. And psychologia, psychology, is literally what you find in the Republic in book 4, is the first great psychology of the human being. Now, there are many different psychologies. You can argue which is right. And just like Freud divides the psyche into 3 parts, superego, ego, and id, Socrates divides the soul into 3 parts. 3 core movements or functions. And now a couple of things. His point is, you can actually see these things at work. They're not imaginary or projections from one person onto another. So let's just say what those 3 parts are, and how that structures and leads to the definition of justice. Well, it turns out we're animals, and we have bodies, and part of our consciousness is linked to our body. And indeed, our sexual, our gustatory, our ownership desires, all those parts that make us feel ourselves as individuals, rooted in our bodily selves, are from the erotic part of the soul, eros. It's the first kind of energy in the soul, and it's the energy in the soul that connects us with our bodies, with our sexual and food pleasures, with our pains. Because interestingly enough, because of the way erotic has come to be meant in modern life, you think all of sexual, and Freud was partially responsible for that. But erotic here means rooted in the personality of the body. And therefore, all kinds of things that we would not call erotic, Plato calls erotic, Socrates calls erotic. The parents and children, having your own children is an erotic desire. Praising and loving your mother, not in the Oedipus sense, but love the members of your family, to love your family. Polemarchus is the erotic individual in some ways in the Republic, because he loves his property, he loves his family, etc. Second part of the soul is by the way is eros is the Greek word for this is thumos. It's the Greek root that survives in enthusiasm. Thumos, thumotic. Now that word has not survived in English, and what this word means is kind of like a spirited anger, like a horse or a dog barking, or what happens when you get angry, or especially in the highest parts of the human soul, the part that loves honor. Because look at how people will fight to the death. And the critical thing psychologically is that where the erotic links you to your body, both its pleasures and pains, when you're in a thumotic state of mind, a spirited state of mind, you actually don't care about your body. And you can actually feel the shift. I once used an example in talking about this from The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. If you can remember, there's the scene where the Rohan army, led by King Theoden, is standing in front of the field of battle, and there are 100,000s of orcs. Excuse me. And Merry and Eowyn, who are riding together, they see and they're just terrified. That terror is an erotic terror because it's a fear of death. And then King Theoden gets them going and marches them, and he smacks all their swords, and they start getting themselves up. Kill, kill. And there is a certain sense but how is this empirical? You can actually see a different function of soul taking over. So people behave quite differently when these different parts of the soul are foremost in them. Now, at the top of the pyramid of the soul is the unique power of reason, which I've already suggested is the power to see sameness and difference, and therefore consciousness. So now, by the way, I want you to know that in this idea, there's a kind of a overlap between reason and spiritedness, and this has to do with orthodox beliefs that the city considers sacred. In other words, how do you know if you're responding to a challenge to an idea of yours, thumotically or logistically or reasonably? If I say to you, I think that the progressive movement is undermining the American institutions and values. All right, there's an opinion. If you're a progressive, then you say, well, you son of a bitch, you moron, you troglodyte right-winger. That's a thumotic opinion. That's an angry opinion because an opinioner has been challenged. A logistic person, a person who isn't dominated by his spirited embrace of his own orthodox opinions, might respond, well, how do you mean by that? In other words, the passion of logos, of reason, is curiosity. The passion of orthodox opinion in defense of one's honor in the city as a soldier is channeled anger, etc. So the soul in book 4 has 3 parts. And it turns out that each of these 3 parts has a corresponding virtue. The moderation, sophrosune, is the virtue that moderates the erotic parts of the soul. And so instead of having one to have like 5,000 wives a night or sex a night, you moderate it to what's good for your soul. You moderate your desires in some ways for wealth and everything like that. Courage is the virtue of the second part of the soul, the spirited and potentially angry part, because courage is what enables you to overcome fear, whereas erotic moderation can still leave you open to fear of death. Thumotic courage often makes you indifferent to the wealth of your own body, the health of your own body. And then at the top, like a pyramid, is wisdom, which channels and trains the reason to see the sameness and difference and truth of things. So at this point, when the structure of the soul has been revealed, and everyone has these parts, but of course what makes one person different from another is which part is uppermost and predominant in the psychological mix of the individual. Then it turns out that there is a virtue that enables all the parts of the soul to operate together and in harmony, where each one does its own work and doesn't interfere with its other parts. So justice at the end of book 4, each part of the soul, the city, because remember they're looking for an analogy of the city grounded to an analogy of the soul. So the three classes in the city will be the working class, the productive class, the ones who have private children, families, and also work for a living and own things. The soldierly class, the army class, which will be clearly devoted to military honor and protecting the city and have no attachment. And the evidence is, by the way, and he kind of reveals this in book 4, is that the rulers, the auxiliaries at the top, who are philosophers, will have no private property, no private family, and the evidence is neither of the soldiers. So in this perfect city, what makes the perfect city just is that each of the classes moderates itself and retains its own function and doesn't try to interfere with the business of the other parts of the city. Partially because each person in each class is there because that's what the state of their soul reveals. So the philosophers that run the city see every soul in the city, and they know what level of eros, thumos, and logos each soul is capable of, and that's how they get assigned in City Plus. Later on in the Republic, there's this huge pyramidical educational scheme where people are observed from the very beginning and trained, and that's how they reveal what their capacities are, and that's how they're placed in the city. So we'll come back to this definition of justice. So justice is the virtue of all the parts of the soul that prevent each part from interfering with each other and doing the thing that it does best. So in book 5, the perfect city comes into being, and Socrates at the end of book 4 has a throwaway line. He says, well, since the best are going to rule in the city, we got to have men and women all doing the same thing, and just drops it. And then the book 5 opens with it's almost that the boys are saying, what did you just say? He slipped it in. And yet, it turns out in book 5, there are 3 critical reforms from conventional city life as it exists in the world that are necessary to bring the perfectly just city into being. The first wave, and by the way, these are presented 2 ways in book 5, as both waves of reform, but also that generate to the conventional world waves of laughter because of their ridiculousness. First, men and women will do the same things. There'll be the abolition of gender roles, because won't you find some woman who's smarter than some man? Maybe most women are smarter than most men. And if you find, unlike Athens, which excluded women from institutional rule, this just city employs everybody's best abilities. And if you should find a woman or many women more philosophically astute than most men, then you have to have women trained as rulers, and therefore sex roles have to go. Second, in order to make that possible and to free women and men from their private spheres, is you have to abolish the family and the private, at least for the upper 2 classes. For the lower class, the working class or the productive class, it's ostensibly, at least for a while, they'll have children and they'll own some property, but the soldiers and the rulers will have no private spouses, no children that they call their own. They call all the children in the city mine, and no property. So the boys don't like this, by the way, and they wonder, how can this be just? But the third wave of reform is the one that generates the most laughter, and it's probably appropriate to read it to you in discussion. This is in book 5, where he gets it, and he says, So next, as it seems, this is like 473b. So next, as it seems, you must try to seek out and demonstrate what is badly done in cities today, and thereby keeps them from being governed in this way. And with what smallest change, preferably one, if not two, and if not fewest in number and the smallest in power, a city would come to this manner of regime. That's entirely certain, he said. Well then, I said, with one change, not, however, a small or an easy one, but possible, we can, in my opinion, show that it would be transformed. What change? Well, here I am, he said. I said, coming to what we liken to the biggest wave of laughter or reputed ridiculousness. But it should be said regardless, even if, exactly like an uproarious wave, it's going to drown me in laughter and ill repute. Consider what I'm going to say. Speak, he said. Unless, I said, the philosophers rule as kings, or those who now called kings and chief genuinely and adequately philosophize, and political power and philosophy coincide in the same place, while the many natures now making their way either to apart from others, the many natures now making their way to apart from the others are by necessary excluded, there is no rest for the ills of the cities, my dear Glaucon, nor, I think, for humankind. Nor will the regime we have described in speech ever come forth for nature, insofar as is possible, and see the light of sun. So, as I playfully put it, you've got to make political science professors. You've got to put political science professors in complete charge of everything. No. We'll explore why that's just, but that's just what happens by the end of Book 5. Book 6 and 7, and Book 6 and 7 are the deepest parts of the public, where they take the quest for ideas and you see the ontological formation for it, and you see how the mind trains itself to go up from physical images and inherited opinions. And in the beginning in Book 7, as I mentioned earlier, the image of the cave. So the image of the cave is showing how everyday people ascend up from opinion and see ultimately philosophic truth. And so the city gets founded, and it's possible, and the last couple of books of the Republic demonstrate, especially Book 9 and 10, that, as we've seen, that when you see what, and what you get in Book 8 and 9, by the way, is kind of what is promised at the end of Book 4, that you can see what a just person is and how he or she degrades into an unjust person. So you get a kind of schema, or a spectrum of justice and injustice. And in the same way, you get a spectrum of just and unjust cities. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And so at the end of Book 9 and 10, where you go through the different regimes like democracy, oligarchy, etc., turns out the worst regime, the most unjust arrangement of a city, is tyranny. And it also turns out at the same time that the tyrant is the unhappiest human being. Why? Because his soul is disordered, and he fears all the time. He has no love or friends, and he's alone, and he's miserable because he's denied himself, by becoming a totally unjust human being, any access to the wells of happiness. So, in some, and I can't talk too much about the myth of air, Socrates' story about the reward for souls after death, which at least some people suggest is a cover to cover up the fact that the soul and the track of the soul and the idea of justice actually is not dependent upon the afterlife and the gods. But that's another issue. In some, Plato would claim that finding the definition of justice identifies the just person, and the opposite identifies the just city, which solves the question of justice and law, and its opposites or perversions, and it identifies the just action and its opposite, all we'll see below, and it demonstrates scientifically, that justice is objectively better than injustice. Now let me summarize I've added these last comments to this revised version of these notes. What have we learned, or what does Polforty think Socrates and Plato teach about justice? Justice is the virtue excellent trait of the soul that allows for the higher to rule the lower, therefore allows each part of the soul to do its work without taking away from the other's functions. That's the broad definition of justice. Justice as first emerges, in other words, as a virtue, as an excellence of the good soul. In fact, in some ways it makes possible the emergence of the good soul, since it allows the moderation of the erotic part of the soul and the courage of the thumatic side of the spirited part of the soul, and the reason to exist as a community within itself. So that's a just person. So you, all right. Second, political justice, the perfectly just city, consists of a regime and a constitution in which, one, the best human beings, and who are these best human beings? The ones who are ruled by reason and desire to know human nature, who are not moved by the love of money, that is to say, the lowest element of the soul, and hence will not be tempted to raid the treasury or exploit the people's wealth or try to put his or her children in power to increase the power of his or her family. If you saw Game of Thrones, there's all that kind of stuff. Or love of honor, the second lowest element of the soul, who will not deify themselves and force everyone in the city to worship them. That's what Sauron wants. That's what Voldemort wants. And that's what Stalin and Hitler and Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping all want. So the second thing is the rulers are not only the best suited, they're philosophically devoted to the knowing of the truth about the human soul and try, in fact, know the human soul best. So, second, the rulers rule for the common good, and the laws embody the common good, hence legal equals just. So, in the perfectly just city, the tension between law and justice now disappears, because every law passed by the just regime is just, and a just person obeys the laws because they are just. Third, the citizens willingly obey justice because justice is part of their souls. So the justice that they carry as a trait in their souls, as a quality of their souls, is both informed by and the support for justice in the larger city. Seeing the pattern of justice in the perfect city allows us to rank politics from best to worst. Philosophic aristocracy, which is what the best regime is, because either one or a few best philosophers rule over everyone. Democracy, which is hereditary aristocracies as they emerge in, like in the Roman Senate, the British lords, and every aristocracy on every side of the globe. What they really are timocrats. Timos means honor. In other words, they accrue a sense of superiority to themselves, whether it's founded or not. And they tend to be autocrats too. But nevertheless, some of them are virtuous in their rule. And then polities based a balance of rich and poor in which the rule of law prevails. And then you see these are getting worse and worse. Oligarchies, rule of the wealthy, where they take the wealth of the poor and accumulate it themselves, and where they identify a good human being with being wealthy. Democracies, rule of the many, and which is the next to the last worst regime, because Plato, Socrates consider the rule of the mob, the many, to be the rule of the uninformed, ignorant, passionate, and factious. Madison comes back to this theme in the Federalist 10. And last and worst, tyrannies, in which the common good disappears completely, and politics has been reduced to power and fear and terror. Tyranny dehumanizes the members of the polis rather than invite them in the common good to develop their humanity. So that's what a just city is. Justice is a virtue in the soul. A just city is, as described, and a just person, or man, is the happy person, is someone whose soul is in harmony with itself, with the various parts in reason, spirit, eros, and not interfering with each other. The most unjust man, the tyrant, turns out to be the unhappiest human being, because his inner life is a torrent of unsatisfied passions, fears, lusts, and in other words, in which he is a slave to himself. So the tyrant who thinks himself to be the freest of human beings because he can order everyone around because they're terrified of him, yet it turns out that he has no peace inside, he has no love, friendship, nobody can trust him, he can't trust anyone, he's always afraid, and he's always lusting after more. So it turns out that the last thing that we apply the word just to, a just action, here I must say, Plato has less to say, perhaps allowing us to complete the sketch. A just deed, so we have a just soul, we have the definition of justice itself, we have a just city, a just person. So what's a just action, a just deed? Perhaps a just deed is an action or a deed performed by a just person, which does what is good for that person and for the others. And as Thrasymachus might have reminded us, even somebody skilled at being just, and even somebody who maintains the virtue of justice as a part of his psychological constitution, can make errors, and that's why perhaps a just person can commit an unjust deed.